The day I left the Kell homestead, I carried three things: a wool blanket rolled and tied across my back, a pair of my father's old boots that were still half a size too large for me, and a leather satchel so worn at the strap that I looped my arm through it rather than trust the buckle. My brother-in-law, Ward, stood on the porch and watched me go, not unkindly, just the way a man watches weather cross a field, patient and certain he isn't the one who will be rained on. The door clicked behind me before I had cleared the gate. It was the second day of March, 1888, in the upper Missouri Valley, and I did not yet understand what that satchel held, or what it would cost me before I did. My name is Nora Kell. I had been Nora Pickard before I married Caleb, and I had been a stonemason's daughter before that. And it is that last thing, more than either of the others, that accounts for everything I am about to tell you. When Caleb died in November of the fever that took 4 men from our township that autumn, Ward claimed the homestead grounds and the 3 fields under rights I could not contest, and did not have money to argue before a judge. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical one. And the difference between those two things is smaller than it feels when you are standing at a gate with a blanket on your back. What remained to me was a parcel of hillside land my father Harn had deeded to me at our wedding. 22 acres of rocky slope and scrub timber at the northeast corner of the valley. Land Ward wanted no part of because it could not be farmed, and the stone outcroppings made it nearly useless for grazing. I had never thought much of it myself. I was 33 years old, a widow in possession of a wool blanket, a pair of boots, and a satchel of my dead father's notes, walking toward a piece of ground no one else wanted. If there is a mercy in the way a life can turn, I had not yet learned to find it. I only knew the cold and the sound of the gate latch behind me. My father, Harn Pickard, had worked stone his whole life, from the Appalachian hollows where he was raised to the Missouri Valley where he died, and he had taught me not as a student sitting at a desk, but as an apprentice who carries the heavy end. I learned to read a wall's face for its faults the way another child learns to read a page, and I learned it the same way, by doing it slowly until the letters stopped looking like a puzzle and started looking like words. I learned to fit a dry stack course by feel as much as by eye, to know from the resistance in my hands when a stone was seated properly and when it was merely resting. My father had a belief about stone and about shelter that he stated plainly, and once only. The summer I was 12, standing at the base of a limestone bluff that threw back heat like a bread oven in August. He said that the earth holds its temperature the way a held breath holds its warmth. That if you let the ground do what it already knows how to do, you will spend a great deal less of your own life fighting the cold. He said it the way he said most things, looking at the stone rather than at me, as if the lesson was addressed to us both, and the wall had as much reason to remember it as I did. I did not know, walking toward that hillside parcel in March of 1888, how long I had been carrying that lesson without knowing its weight. The 22 acres had a boundary wall along its eastern edge, a dry stacked limestone construction my father had put up himself sometime in the late 1860s before I was born, when the land was first surveyed and marked. I had seen it twice in my life, both times as a child accompanying my father on his rounds of the valley properties he maintained, and I remembered it mainly as a long gray line broken by scrub and lichen, unremarkable to a child who had grown up beside stone walls the way others grow up beside wood fences. What I did not remember, because I had not been old enough to pay attention, or because my father had not thought to point it out to me, was the door. It was set into the eastern face of the wall at a place where a natural limestone shelf jutted out from the hillside, and the wall ran up against it, fitting so cleanly against the rock that the seam was swallowed by moss and 3 seasons of old leaves. The door itself was timber, low and thick, with iron hinges forged in a style my father had favored, square-shouldered and plain, and it sat in a cut stone arch that was almost completely hidden by a fall of dead bramble. I found it on my fourth morning on the land, walking the wall's length with Rue at my heel, the dog I had brought from the Kell place, a dark brown cattle dog with a broad head and an old scar across one shoulder from a fence wire she had never learned to respect. Rue put her nose to the base of the door before I even saw it was there, and when I cleared the bramble and pulled the iron handle, the air that came out was not cold. It was the temperature of a root cellar in late October. That particular held stillness that the earth keeps below the frost line, and it smelled of limestone dust and old clay and something faintly green, which turned out to be the seep my father had built into the back of a natural spring room, following the hillside's own slope downward so that the ceiling was low on the entrance side and rose toward the back where a thin sheet of water ran down the stone face and collected in a shallow basin he had chiseled level. The room was roughly 12 feet by 18 feet, taller at the back than at the door, and he had lined it with dry stacked limestone on 3 sides, fitted close enough that no daylight came through anywhere except a hairline along the top of the doorframe. On the floor, buried under 2 decades of drift and a fine gray silt, were the things he had stored there and never returned to collect. 3 ceramic crocks sealed with beeswax, a folded canvas tarpaulin, a broad-bladed mattock, a draw chisel, and a tin box the size of a cigar case, latched shut with a bent nail. I opened that box at the back of the room with Rue sitting in the entrance behind me, and inside it I found a folded paper bearing an elevation sketch of the room's construction, drafted in my father's clean, spare hand, with measurements and a note in the margin that said, in letters I had to angle toward the door to read, "The stone carries the cold out if you pack the air." That was all. 7 words, in pencil, in his hand, and all the instruction I needed. I will say here, for those of you who have found your way to this account, that what I did next was not what the valley expected of a woman in my position, and that if you stay with this story, you will understand, in time, why it mattered. What I did was go back to town for cornmeal and salt pork, spend what little cash I'd carried out of the Kell place, and begin to dig. The plan was not complex, but it required time, and it required understanding what the ground was already doing before I added anything of my own to it. My father's room was the beginning of something, a demonstration, really, of a principle he had understood and built at small scale. What I intended was to extend it, to deepen the room by following the slope of the hillside another 14 feet, to raise the ceiling by cutting into the limestone shelf rather than building down from it, and then to bank the exterior with the best insulating material the valley had in abundance, which was not timber and was not sod and was not the mud plaster the homesteaders used on their walls. It was straw, dry, tightly packed, densely bundled prairie straw laid against the outer stone wall and banked with earth on top of that, creating a dead air layer between the stone and the freeze line that would hold the interior at the temperature my father had described. The breath-held warmth the earth already knew how to keep. There was a ventilation shaft to consider, a narrow vertical bore up through the limestone shelf to allow air exchange without losing the thermal mass, and there was the drainage of the seep to manage so that the floor stayed dry, and there was the fitting of a second door at the new entrance, heavier than the first, set in a short tunnel passage that would break the wind before it reached the main chamber. These were not mysteries. They were the things my father had taught me to think about, standing at stone walls in the summer heat, asking me where the water would go in a rain, and which face of the stone would hold the warmth and which would shed it. The excavation took from late April through the end of June, with the mattock my father had left and a second one I borrowed from a neighbor, and did not return until autumn. The limestone shelf was cooperative in the way stone cooperates when you work with its grain, rather than against it, splitting clean along the natural seams so that each cut went where I asked it to go, and the rubble came away in manageable pieces rather than in the unexpected shards that come when you force stone past what it wants to give. I hauled the rubble out in a canvas sling and stacked it along the outer wall, where it would later serve as the foundation for the straw banking. The floor of the extended room I leveled by tamping and then by laying a course of flat limestone set close, no mortar, the same tight fit my father had used, so that the clay underneath stayed sealed and the surface stayed dry even in the season when the seep ran heaviest, which was April and May, when the snowmelt came down through the hill's buried veins. Rue helped in the way dogs help, which is to say she was present and warm at my feet in the evenings, and alert to things I could not hear during the days. And my nephew Jasper arrived in June, sent by my brother from his place 2 counties north, a boy of 9 with a face full of freckles and the particular talent of quiet children for appearing at the right moment with a tool you needed. Jasper asked few questions and carried many loads of rubble out of the excavation, and in the evenings he sat with the elevation drawing my father had made and traced the lines with his finger as I explained what each one meant. He called Rue by her name without being told it, and she accepted him without ceremony, which I took as a favorable judgment. I will tell you here, those of you who have stayed with this account, that the moment I want you to hold in mind is not the storm and not the recognition that came after it, but this one, mid-August of 1888, Jasper asleep against the outer wall in the late afternoon shade, Rue flat in the dust beside him, and me standing back to look at what was being made. The first thing I felt was my father. The second thing was something that had no name, except that it was the opposite of the feeling I had carried through the Kellgate in March. Stay with me. The straw banking went in through July and August, 6 bundled courses laid tight against the outer wall from the foundation rubble to the overhang of the limestone shelf, each course tamped and then covered with a layer of clay-heavy soil that I packed by walking across it in the heavy boots my father had left me, the same way he had taught me to settle a clay floor, slowly in rows, the weight of a body doing what a mallet cannot. The earth banking over the top I built to a slope so that rainwater ran away from the entrance passage, rather than pooling against it. The ventilation shaft I bored with an iron bar and patience, working downward through 4 feet of limestone shelf in a column no wider than my forearm. And when I had it through, I set a copper pipe inside the bore and capped the top with a cone of bent wire mesh to keep the birds out in summer and the ice from sealing it in winter. The second door I hung myself on a Saturday in September, a heavy timber piece I had cut and fitted from a board of white oak I had traded 2 days of stonemasonry work to obtain from a man on the West Road. And when it was hung and the passage was complete, the 2-door arrangement created an entry of trapped still air between them, an airlock, though I would not have used that word, only that the outer door closed before the inner one opened, and the warmth stayed where it belonged. The community had opinions. In the valley, opinions were formed on porches and at the store counter and at the Methodist social held each month in warm weather, and they traveled with the efficiency of creek water finding its level, which is to say they went where they went without consulting anyone. Clem Sutter ran the general store at the edge of town, a man of middle age with a gray beard trimmed to a point and an inclination to speak for the community as if it had elected him to the post. He had not been unkind to me in the months following Caleb's death, but he had been of the opinion, stated with the mild certainty of a man who has never doubted a position he has held for more than 40 years, that the hillside parcel was fit for nothing, and that whatever I was doing with it would prove his point in time. The first time he said this openly was in September of that year, when I came in for a sack of oats and he asked from behind the counter what I was digging up there, with the air of a man asking about the weather. And I said I was improving a root cellar. And he said to the two men at the far end of the counter, without lowering his voice, that Nora Kell was down to digging her own grave in the hillside. He laughed when he said it. It was a mild laugh, not cruel, the kind a man makes when he believes he's being accurate rather than funny. By November, the name had traveled. People referred to it as Nora's Hole, spoken in the tone one uses for a thing both pitied and faintly absurd, the way you might speak of a neighbor's twice-failed kitchen garden, or a plan that everyone could see the end of except the person making it. Clem said it at the social that month, in front of perhaps 12 people gathered at the church house for the November meeting, and a woman named Ruth Pace, who lived on the South Road, said quietly that she thought it was a fine idea and wished more people had a place like it. And Clem said that a hole was still a hole, no matter how much straw you packed around it. And Tom Grange, standing at the back with his arms folded, said he had heard stranger things work and let it rest there, which was not exactly a defense of me, but was the closest thing to one that room was going to produce. Ruth caught my eye as I turned to leave and gave me a small nod, the kind that means I know what you know. And I carried that home with me like a coal in my pocket, small and warm. The third time I heard the name, it was December, a cold, clear afternoon when I came down the hill for a tin of coal oil, and a man I did not know well, a recent homesteader named Pitts who had been in the valley less than a year, asked Clem what that green mound on the northeast hillside was. Clem said it was Nora's Hole, and Pitts looked at me, standing 6 feet away, and had the grace to color slightly. And Clem, to his partial credit, said it without cruelty, only as a fact he had long since decided, the way you point out a landmark on a road. I paid for the coal oil and carried it up the hill and did not say anything, which was the only response worth making. The work continued through December. The second door was fitted and sealed, the straw banking completed and earthed over, the ventilation shaft capped, the drainage complete. My father's crocks, when I opened them, held dried apple rings and rendered lard, still good after 20 years in that constant temperature, which told me everything I needed to know about what the space was capable of. The tin box I kept on the ledge my father had cut in the limestone, not because it held anything else I needed, but because it had his handwriting in it, and the room felt right with it there. I began storing in October through November and December, adding to the chamber until the shelves held 100 pounds of cornmeal, 60 pounds of dried beans, salt pork in brine, dried apple and dried plum, 2 crocks of rendered tallow, 2 extra wool blankets, and a quarter cord of split white oak stacked at the entrance end beside the small iron stove I had bought from a family selling out on the road to town. A 2-burner box stove with a pipe that drew up through the ventilation shaft and handled smoke without stealing heat. I did not know, laying in those stores through December, what January would ask of them. I only knew the space was ready, and that readiness had been my father's first instruction, repeated in every wall he had ever built. You do not prepare against the storm you are afraid of. You prepare against the one you have not imagined yet. The morning of January the 7th, 1889, I woke to a sky the color of a pewter cup, flat and close, with a quality of stillness in the air that my father had taught me to read, as a held breath before the cough. The temperature at the surface was 6 degrees below zero by mid-morning. By evening it was 14 below. By midnight, when the wind came down from the northwest, it was 20 below and dropping. And the wind was not the ordinary kind that comes with winter in the valley, the kind that stings and passes, but the kind that comes through walls, that finds the gaps you thought you had sealed and the places the thinking had not reached. It came as 3 days of it, uninterrupted so that the word storm does not quite serve, because a storm implies a shape with a beginning and a peak and a release, and what arrived that January had only a beginning and a long pressing middle, 26 degrees below zero by the second morning, 41 straight hours of wind-driven cold before it eased, and then a third day of still air at 22 below. That was worse in some ways than the wind, because still air at that temperature is a weight, a pressing down, and it does not have even the movement of the wind to remind you that something is happening. The snow was not deep, no more than 14 inches over the valley floor, but the cold drove it into every gap, packed it against every door, frosted every nail in every board, and worked at the valley's structures the way water works at clay, finding the weakness and pressing until the weakness opened. I had been storing for 3 months. The root chamber held the quarter cord of split hardwood, the cornmeal and beans, the salt pork, the dried fruit, the tallow for the lamp, and the seep, which never stopped running because it came from below the frost line, which was the thing my father had understood when he chose that hillside and built that first room. Rue slept in the main chamber between Jasper and the wall, and on the first night of the freeze, Jasper pulled the extra blanket over her without being asked, which was the kind of child he was. The temperature inside on the second morning, when I held the small glass thermometer I had thought to bring in from the surface, was 41 degrees. Outside, men were burning fence rails and broken furniture to keep their animals from freezing in the barns. Tom Grange on the North Road lost 11 head of cattle on the second night. He told me afterward he had burned every split piece of wood he owned, plus 3 wooden chairs and a parlor table, and had not kept the barn above freezing. His wife and 2 children had stayed inside the farmhouse with the kitchen stove running full, burning green cottonwood when the seasoned wood ran out, and had kept the house at perhaps 30 degrees by the second morning, cold enough that the water in the basin on the kitchen shelf frosted over each night. The Birch family, a quarter-mile south, lost their youngest child's 3 goats and one of their 2 horses, and were out of firewood by the morning of the third day. They came to me on the afternoon of that third day, the whole family of 4, the father carrying the smallest child, the mother with her head down against the wind, all of them coated in ice at the brow and the collar, and I brought them in through the passage and set them by the stove at the entrance end of the main chamber, the stove that ran on split hardwood and whose pipe went up through the ventilation shaft and kept the interior, on the coldest night of those 3, at 43 degrees. 43 degrees inside when it was 22 degrees below outside. That is a difference of 65 degrees from the air beyond my door, and I did not engineer it by burning more wood than I had. I engineered it by listening to what my father had told a limestone bluff about the breath the earth holds, and then building a room that did the same. By the morning of the third day, there were 9 people in my cellar room besides Jasper and me. The Birch family, Tom Grange and his wife and his hired man, and a young woman named Delia who had been living alone in a cabin half a mile up the slope and had followed the wall to my door by feel, in the dark, on the second night, with her shawl frozen to her collar. I had water from the seep and cornmeal, and beans and dried fruit and tallow for the lamp, and I had firewood enough for 4 more days if we burned carefully. The stove ran on that cord of split oak, and we did not run out. 43 degrees was the coldest the room reached. When the wind dropped on the morning of the 4th day, I opened the outer door and then the inner door, and the cold came in like a wall, and I stood in the entrance passage and breathed it, and felt it pass around me without taking the room. It was Clem Sutter who came that afternoon. I heard him before I saw him, his voice outside the outer door, asking if there was room, which told me the cold had taken something from him, because Clem did not ask, he stated. He came in through the passage with ice in his beard, and stopped in the entrance of the main chamber, and the warmth came around him the way warmth does in a truly insulated space, not a sudden rush but a settled presence, like stepping from shadow into sun in April. He stood there for a long moment without speaking, looking at the lamp and the stove and the 9 people, and the dog and the boy, and the provisions on the ledge, and the steady thin sound of the seep in the back. Then he looked at me, and the expression on his face was the one I had not allowed myself to expect. Not triumph for me, not humiliation for him. Just the plain reckoning of a man who has been wrong for a long time about one specific thing and knows it down to the grain. He said very quietly, "Your father knew what he was doing." He did not say anything else. He sat down on the bench beside Tom Grange and held his hands near the stove and did not speak again for a long while, and I went back to the seep to check the basin level and did not speak either. And that silence between us was worth more than anything either of us could have said. The freeze broke that evening. The temperature at the valley floor rose to 4 below by midnight and to 12 above by noon the next day, and the homesteaders came out of what they had managed to keep themselves alive in, blinking and counting what was left. The losses across the valley were considerable. 6 horses, 23 head of cattle, 2 mule teams, a number of hogs, no one bothered to count precisely, and 4 miles of fence rail that had been burned for heat, and a well house on the north road that had burst its stone casing and would need to be rebuilt from the footing. My own count was nothing. No stock lost because I had none. No firewood run out. No frozen pipes. No family frostburned beyond the chill they had walked through to reach my door. 11 people had been in that chamber over the 3 days, and 11 people came out of it. By March of that year, a county recorder named Aldous Fenn had ridden up to the hillside parcel to examine the construction, referred by Tom Grange, who had that particular quality of some men who survive an emergency by someone else's grace, and spend the rest of their days telling people about it as a form of gratitude. Aldous Fenn walked every inch of the outer banking and the entrance passage and stood in the main chamber for a long time, asking me questions in his dry, careful way, writing the answers in a ledger he carried. He asked about the straw-packing depth and the ventilation and the seep drainage and the door fitting, and I told him what I had done and where I had learned it. And when he asked about my father, I said he was a stonemason who had worked this valley for 30 years, and Aldous Fenn wrote that down too, carefully, as if it were a structural specification rather than a memory, which perhaps it was. He copied the elevation drawing from my father's tin box, asked my permission before he did it, and thanked me afterward in the way of a man who understands he has received something that did not belong to him by right. The account Aldous Fenn produced was copied and distributed to the county extension office and read at 2 homesteaders' meetings that spring, and by summer there were 3 men in the valley digging similar rooms on hillside parcels where the limestone shelf allowed it. 2 of them dug the right dimensions and packed the straw and installed the ventilation and the drainage. And when the following winter came and was cold, though not as cold as the Great Freeze, their rooms held at the temperature my father had understood. The breath of the earth held steady. The 3rd man dug the dimensions and skipped the straw, reasoning that the stone itself was insulation enough, and his room was cold as a well house in January, which proved nothing about the method and everything about the principle my father had placed in that tin box. The principle that it is the held air, not the stone alone, that keeps the warmth. You can copy the shape of a thing and miss entirely what the shape is for. The understanding is the only part that travels. Clem Sutter came to my door in September of that year with a ham and a sack of dried beans, which was his way of saying what he had said in the cellar without having to say it twice, and I accepted them without ceremony, which was my way of receiving it. He stood on the hillside looking at the banked earth over the chamber roof, greened now with late-season grass, and said it was not as ugly as he had expected, and I said I had not built it to be looked at from the outside. He said nothing to that. He walked back down the hill toward the road, and I watched him go and did not feel the thing I had expected to feel, which was some form of satisfaction at the distance between what he had thought and what was true. What I felt was closer to something quieter, more like the end of a long task, the way a completed wall looks at dusk when you step back and see it whole, and the light is going, and you are tired in the right way. Jasper grew up on that hillside. He learned to dress stone from the same satchel of notes I'd carried from the Kellgate, the elevation drawings and the margin notes in my father's hand, and he added his own drawings to the satchel when he was older. Improvements and corrections and a second ventilation design he worked out from principle rather than from experience, sitting in the main chamber in the evenings with a stub of pencil and a board across his knees. Ruth Pace brought her daughter to see the construction in the spring of 1890, and the daughter brought her own children 15 years after that. And each time the question they asked was the same question Aldous Fenn had asked, about the straw and the air and the principle, not about the dimensions or the door. Rue was with Jasper for 8 more years after the freeze, slowing by degrees until she spent most of her days on the warm clay floor of the main chamber, moving from the stove end to the seep end with the deliberate pace of an old animal that knows every inch of its world and has stopped needing any of it to be different. I was not with her when she went. Jasper was. He told me afterward that she went in her sleep, which I believe, and that she had been warm, which I know. The valley changed in the years that followed, as all valleys do, as new people came, and the old ones passed and the memory of the great freeze was carried forward by those who had survived it, and quietly set aside by those who arrived too late to be humbled by it. But the design persisted in a way that designs persist when they are understood, rather than merely copied, passed from hand to hand, with the understanding that the principle is the straw-packed air, and the drainage, and the ventilation, and the held breath of the earth beneath the frost line, not the dimensions of any particular room, and not the name of the woman who extended what her father had built. Some called it the Kell method, and some called it hill sheltering, and some had no name for it at all, only a set of practices they had learned from a neighbor, who had learned from a neighbor who had stood in a warm room on a frozen hillside and understood. The name mattered less than the principle, and the principle mattered less than the willingness to trust what the ground already knew how to do. I am old now, and the hillside is Jasper's, and the room my father built and I extended has been twice repaired at the seep wall and once recapped at the ventilation shaft, and it keeps its temperature the same as it kept it on the night of January the 9th, 1889, which is to say at the level the earth below the frost line has always held, patient and unhurried, indifferent to what happens on the surface. That constancy is not magic. It is physics, and it is patience, and it is a dead stonemason's 7 words in a margin, carried in a tin box for 20 years through cold and silence until the right person opened the right door and found them. That satchel of my father's notes is with Jasper's children now. The strap was repaired twice, and the leather at the corners has gone soft as cloth, and the elevation drawing of the original room is fragile at the folds, but the margin note is still legible, 7 words in pencil in his hand, and I am told that Jasper's oldest daughter reads it to her children as a kind of instruction, which is the only way I would have wanted it carried. The wall is still there, the eastern boundary wall of the 22 acres, the long gray line my father set before I was born. and that has outlasted everything the valley has tested it with. Frost and flood, and the slow weight of time pushing at the coursed stone. The second door I fitted still opens on its iron hinges, though they need grease in the cold months, and the seep still runs down the back face of the limestone and collects in the basin. My father chiseled level, constant as it has always been, fed from a depth the frost cannot reach. If you stand in that room in January, when the valley is locked in cold and the surface is bright and silent, and the breath goes white at the door, the air inside settles around you at the temperature of a root cellar in October, held there by packed straw and earthen banking and a ventilation shaft no wider than a forearm, and by the principle my father stated once to a limestone bluff and a 12-year-old girl who was paying more attention than she knew. He was right about the ground. He was right about most things. I just had to find the door he had left for me before I could begin to understand how much he had known.